She set up in lane 9 without saying a word. No introduction, no conversation, just a worn canvas duffel bag, a pair of scuffed tactical gloves, and a Beretta M9 that looked like it had been through more countries than most people visit in a lifetime. The regulars noticed immediately. They always did. A woman in her late 30s, grey hoodie, dark aviators, despite the overcast sky outside. Moving with the kind of deliberate economy that doesn't come from a gun store class or a YouTube tutorial. She loaded her magazine the way surgeons scrub their hands, automatic, precise, completely internal. Nobody said anything yet, but the looks were already being exchanged. Then she raised the pistol, exhaled once, and fired. 10 rounds, 10 dead center hits. A 2-inch grouping at 15 yards, tight enough that you'd have to squint to count the holes separately. And in the back of that range, 3 men who called themselves shooters put down their guns and went very, very quiet. They didn't know what they were looking at. But they were about to find out. If you believe real skill never needs to introduce itself, type precision in the comments below. The Ridgeline Shooting Center outside Fort Merritt wasn't the kind of range that made it into magazines. No air conditioning worth mentioning. Steel targets, gravel underfoot, fluorescent lights that hummed at exactly the frequency that made long sessions feel longer. It was a working range, practical and unglamorous, which is exactly why its regulars loved it. They had built something there, or at least they believed they had. A community of men who came every Thursday morning with purpose. Former law enforcement officers, ex-military or at least men who presented as such. Weekend competitors, the kind of shooters who wore their certifications on their sleeves, literally and figuratively, and who knew every other face in the room. What they had actually built was an atmosphere, one with unspoken rules about who belonged and who didn't, one with a social architecture so familiar to its members that they barely noticed it existed. Brad Kowalski had been coming to Ridgeline for 4 years, broad-shouldered, loud-voiced, the first to offer unsolicited technique advice to anyone who hadn't earned the right to refuse it. He'd worked security for 12 years, managed to translate that into a self-described weapons expertise that he deployed generously and often. Brad was not a bad person. He was the kind of person who had never been made uncomfortable enough to examine himself. Jake Mercer was Brad's Thursday companion, former mall security, a decade younger, a reliable audience. Where Brad projected authority, Jake projected agreement. Between them and 7 other men who came and went with the seasons, Ridgeline on Thursdays functioned like an informal club with no written bylaws, but absolute membership criteria. She didn't meet any of them. She signed the waiver at the front desk with quick, precise handwriting. She asked no questions. She took lane 9, which was open because nobody else wanted to be near the column that blocked the sightline at the far end. She didn't need the sightline she was using. She's probably looking for her boyfriend's gun. Jake said it under his breath. Brad's shoulders shook once with the laugh he didn't bother to hide. She didn't look up. She was already running her hands over the frame of the M9, checking components with a tactile fluency that had nothing to do with novelty and everything to do with repetition under conditions far beyond what this range had ever seen. The timer buzzed. She raised, exhaled, and fired. 10 rounds. The kind of grouping that makes experienced shooters put down their weapons and walk closer. Research from military training records has consistently found that women who come from shooting backgrounds tend to outperform expectations. A retired colonel once documented that in his units, all the women fired expert on their first qualification day, while less than a third of the men managed the same. The assumption that women are inherently less capable with a firearm is not a trained observation. It is a bias that doesn't survive contact with evidence. She moved to the Steel Challenge course without being asked, without performing for anyone. 6 plates arranged in sequence. The competitive standard for a good shooter is a 5-second clear. The world-class standard is closer to 3. She drew ping, 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 3.2 seconds. All plates. The sound of the last one still ringing when her gun was already back at low ready. Brad looked at Jake, Jake looked at Brad. "Lucky grouping," Brad said, loudly enough that people heard. "Because if you say it loudly enough, you don't have to believe it alone." She moved to the next station, a 45 ACP, then an AR-15, then a .38 revolver with a trigger pull that would have made a less experienced shooter flinch and compensate. Then a bolt-action rifle that looked like it had been manufactured before some of these men were born, every shot placed, every reload smooth. Not a single wasted movement, not a single adjustment that signaled uncertainty. She switched to her left hand between stages without pausing, ambidextrous and equally precise with both. Marcus Webb, the range safety officer, had been watching from the window of the office. Marcus had been a Marine. He knew what he was looking at. He'd seen thousands of shooters across 12 years of running this range, and he could grade technique the way a conductor grades a musician. Not just the notes, but the understanding behind them. He picked up his phone. He wasn't calling for help. He was verifying something, because what he was watching didn't fit the file he had in his head for civilian recreational shooters, and Marcus had learned to trust the feeling that something was categorically different from what it appears to be. Brad tried once more. He walked to the edge of her lane, puffed up, and spoke loudly enough to be a performance. "Hey, where'd you learn to shoot like that? YouTube University?" She didn't answer. She didn't look at him. She loaded a fresh magazine, raised the pistol, and fired 3 rounds before Brad had finished the sentence. 3 holes appeared in the paper, overlapping each other at center mass. The message wasn't verbal. It didn't need to be. The range had gone quiet in a way that ranges only do when something unexpected is happening. Not the silence of a lull between activities. The silence of people who have stopped what they were doing because something more important is occurring, and they haven't decided yet how to process it. According to a national survey by the Service Women's Action Network, 74% of female veterans report feeling unrecognized by the public, and 48% identified gender bias as the most significant challenge facing the community of female service members. It is not an abstract statistic. It lives in moments exactly like this one, in rooms where a woman's competence is treated as an anomaly to be explained away rather than a fact to be acknowledged. She kept shooting. Brad walked back to his lane. He didn't say anything. He picked up his weapon and found that his hands were doing the thing that experienced shooters recognize in themselves when they've been genuinely unsettled. A slight overgrip, a tension in the forearms that doesn't serve the shot. Jake stared at the far wall and said nothing. Marcus was still on his phone. They heard it before they saw it. A heavy engine, steady, not a civilian vehicle. The kind of engine management that comes standard on vehicles designed to carry weight under pressure and not complain about it. Through the front windows of the range, a black military Humvee rolled into the parking lot. No civilian plates. Official DoD markings. 2 antenna mounts on the roof. It parked without haste, and 2 figures stepped out. Military police. Full-dress uniforms. Moving with the particular efficiency of people who are not rushing but are also not wasting a single step. They walked directly to lane 9. The range had gone completely still. Nobody pretended to shoot. Nobody performed indifference. Every eye in the building tracked those 2 MPs as they crossed the floor and reached her station. The taller of the 2, a sergeant with the kind of steady eyes that come from having seen actual consequences, leaned close and said something quiet. Whatever it was, it took fewer than 10 seconds. She safety-checked the M9, holstered it with the same mechanical precision she'd demonstrated on every other action for the past 40 minutes, picked up the duffel, didn't look back, didn't wave, didn't acknowledge the room that was watching her with the collective expression of people who have just realized they may have profoundly misread a situation. The MPs walked beside her the way protocol dictates for someone being escorted, not apprehended. They held no weapons, made no commands, moved as an escort, not an arrest. She walked through the door. The Humvee started. It drove away. Total time on the premises, less than an hour. Marcus came out of the office 5 minutes later. His face had the color of someone who has just read something that rearranged what he thought he understood about the last 40 minutes. "You guys," he said. His voice was steady, but barely. "You need to see this." He held up his phone. A Department of Defense press release. The photograph at the top was unmistakable. No gray hoodie in the image, no dark aviators. Full tactical kit. A row of service ribbons that told a story most people in this room didn't have the vocabulary to read. Hair pulled back in a regulation bun, eyes looking directly into the camera with the particular calm of someone who has stared at things much more threatening than a lens. Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez, U.S. Army Marksmanship Unit, assigned to the 173rd Airborne Brigade. Marcus read from the screen, his voice dropping slightly. She had enlisted at 19. She grew up shooting on a family ranch, learned the fundamentals from an uncle, and found that marksmanship came naturally from the beginning. Basic training revealed a qualification score that put her in a category most male recruits spent months trying to reach. The Army saw it. Certain people within the Army made sure she had a path. The U.S. Army Marksmanship Unit at Fort Benning is the service's elite competitive shooting organization. Its members don't just compete. They instruct, they develop doctrine, they hold national records. She'd been assigned there 2 years into her service. She'd spent the years since then training other soldiers in rifle marksmanship from the foundational level to advanced long-range engagement. She'd traveled to inter-service championships. At the Inter-Service Rifle Championship, only a handful of women had ever competed against the full military field, and the ones who did consistently placed in ranges that surprised the men who hadn't been paying attention. She had been one of those women. The press release was about a regional marksmanship development program. She was leading it. She was in town for 3 days of evaluation and had apparently decided to use a few hours of her own time at a civilian range because that's the kind of person who rises to that level, one for whom shooting isn't a hobby that gets suspended when work gets busy. It's integrated, it's reflexive. Brad sat down in a plastic chair near the back of the range. He put his elbows on his knees and his head in his hands. "We laughed at her," he said. He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular. Jake was still looking at lane 9. She could have told us. She could have said something. Marcus shook his head. He had the tone of someone who had already moved past where Brad and Jake were still standing. People like that don't need to announce themselves. Their work does it eventually. The only question is whether you're paying attention when it does. By noon, the story had reached the coffee shop 2 blocks from the range. By evening, 3 Facebook groups in the county had fragments of it. By the following Thursday, the shape of the room at Ridgeline had changed in ways that were hard to articulate but impossible to miss. The swagger was quieter, not absent. People don't transform overnight, but recalibrated. Men who had been performing confidence for each other started performing competence instead, which is a different thing entirely and a more honest one. Her platoon sergeant would later say that what made her remarkable wasn't just the shooting. It was that she came to work every day with the intention of making not just herself better, but the entire organization around her better. That quality doesn't announce itself. It accumulates, and it tends to reveal itself in exactly the moments that matter. Marcus made a decision. He taped a printed page to the wall beside lane 9. Not a photograph, not a tribute, just the factual summary of her record, where she trained, what she'd achieved, what she'd gone on to teach. A document, not a monument. Something that answered the question a new shooter might one day ask. Who was the last person to use this lane, and why does it feel like it matters? Young women started coming on Thursday mornings. Some of them had been wanting to come for months and had been quietly calculating whether the atmosphere was worth navigating. The calculation changed. Maria, a 22-year-old who'd been shooting her grandmother's revolver in her apartment parking lot and wanted to learn properly, showed up on a Saturday and told Marcus she'd come because of what she'd heard. If someone like that could handle their nonsense, maybe she could too. Marcus walked her to lane 9. The older men who came through in subsequent weeks were different in another way, veterans of different eras who had heard the story through channels that civilian social media didn't reach, through unit networks, through VA waiting rooms, through the kind of word of mouth that moves among people who understand what military service actually involves. An older man with a Purple Heart pin on his jacket spent 20 minutes studying the page on the wall, then fired slow, deliberate shots at Lane 9 for an hour. When he finished, he stood at attention and saluted the empty lane. Marcus found a reason to look elsewhere. Some moments belonged to their participants. 3 weeks after the Thursday that changed the range, a cardboard box arrived. 2 MPs delivered it. They handed it to Marcus without explanation and left. Inside, a handwritten note on military letterhead. For Lane 9, tell them it's never about who's loudest. EV. Beneath the note, 3 custom steel targets and a hand-drawn range card showing advanced marksmanship drills. The kind of training material that doesn't get sold in stores. The kind that gets developed through years of application under conditions that test every assumption. Marcus had the note framed. It went up beside the page. She had begun shooting at 5 years old, growing up around competition, learning early that precision was not a gift, but a practice, something you built over years of quiet, repetitive, unglamorous work. That Thursday morning at Ridgeline wasn't her proving anything to anyone. It was simply her existing in her capability while other people caught up to what that meant. She never returned to the range. Or if she did, no one who had been there that day was present to see it. But Lane 9 stayed designated. No walk-ins, no photography, no noise beyond what the work required. Because some contributions are measured not in recognition received, but in the spaces they quietly rearrange long after they've moved on. Brad returned 7 months later. He was quieter. He asked Marcus if he could join the Thursday program. I need to learn how to shoot properly, he said, and more importantly, how to act properly. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded toward Lane 9. She'd probably respect that. If you believe that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the most qualified, subscribe to Code of Valor, where the quietest soldiers carry the heaviest missions. And legacy doesn't need volume, just accuracy.